5 years after the war, the scars still bled in silence beneath a lead-colored sky. Silas, a farmer with hands hardened by the earth and a solitary soul, found Nira chained to the wreckage of a wagon. What began as an act of mercy in a world of hatred was about to seal the fate of both of them forever. The smoke reached Silas before anything else did. It curled low through the pines, thick and bitter, carrying the smell of charred wood and something else, something older and heavier he could not name. He pulled his draft horse to a stop on the frontier trail and squinted ahead. The wagons were still smoldering. He climbed down slowly, boots sinking into the black mud. 3 merchant carts, all tipped on their sides, crates split open, grain bags torn, coins scattered in the dirt like broken teeth. Whatever had done this had done it fast, and it had done it with fury. Silas walked carefully between the debris, his weathered coat catching on splintered planks. He was not a lawman. He was not a bounty hunter. He was a farmer who had taken the long trail because the river road had flooded again, and now he wished he had waited for the water to fall. He almost missed her. She was pinned behind the largest cart, the iron wheel resting on a massive black chain that wrapped around both her wrists and one ankle. The chain links were thick and dark, stained with rust and something red. Her skin was a deep, rich green, the green of river moss after a long rain, and she was built like someone who had spent a lifetime earning every muscle. Her ears tapered to sharp points, and where her lips pressed tight against each other, he could see the faint curve of 2 small tusks. She was an orc. She watched him approach without flinching. Her amber eyes did not beg. They measured. Silas stopped 3 steps away. He had seen orcs in the war. He had buried men who died fighting them. He had also buried men who died alongside them, though nobody in Haldvast liked to remember that part. The war had a way of flattening everything into something simpler than it actually was. "You alone?" he asked. She said nothing. Her jaw was set like a stone wall. He looked around the wreckage again. No other survivors, no attackers still lurking, just the wind, the cooling ash, and the 2 of them. He crouched down and pulled his field blade from his belt, a heavy iron tool he used to split fence posts, and studied the chain. The links were old but solid. He would need leverage and patience. He pressed the blade down hard. The blade rang against the iron, and sparks jumped into the mud. Silas shifted his grip and struck again, angling the edge into the weakest point of the link, working the metal with the patience of a man who had spent his life pulling things loose from the earth. The orc spoke. Her words came out low and rough, guttural syllables stacked against each other like river stones. He did not understand the language, but the tone was perfectly clear. She was warning him away. She was telling him she would rather stay chained than accept help from a human hand. "I understand that," Silas said without looking up. "But you will die here by nightfall, so I am going to keep going." She went quiet. He struck the link 4 more times until the metal cracked and gave with a sharp pop. He moved to the chain around her ankle next, and then the second wrist. Each time he felt the weight of her eyes on him, not grateful, not hostile, just watching, reading every move with the careful attention of someone who had survived too many bad decisions made by people who smiled first. When the last chain fell, she did not move immediately. She flexed her fingers, then her wrists, watching the blood return beneath her green skin. A long cut ran from her left palm to her elbow, where the iron had bitten in. She did not look at it the way a person looks at pain. She looked at it the way a person looks at a reminder. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his water skin. He held it out toward her, arm extended, steady and unhurried. Her hands trembled when she took it. She drank deeply and then held it back to him without a word. He noticed she was barefoot. He noticed the bruises on her shoulders, old ones layered under newer ones. He noticed that her leather clothing, what remained of it, was marked with symbols along the collar, tiny carvings that had been partially scraped away, as if someone had tried to erase them. He did not ask about any of it. "There is a trail camp about 2 hours north," he said, packing the water skin away. "Safe enough for the night." She stood slowly, testing her legs. She was tall, nearly a head above him, And even in her condition she moved with a deliberate, weighted grace that made the air around her feel different. She looked at the horizon, then back at him. She did not agree. She did not refuse. She simply waited. Silas took that as good enough and started walking. The trail to the camp wound through shadow pine and narrow creek crossings, and Silas led the horse by its bridle, while the orc followed behind at a distance that felt carefully chosen, close enough to keep him in sight, far enough to run if she needed to. He did not push conversation. He had never been a man of many words even with people he trusted, and trust was something neither of them had earned from the other yet. So he let the forest do the talking, the creak of pine branches, the wet drip from the canopy, the distant call of a nightjar beginning its evening complaint. When they reached the camp, a stone ring, a patch of cleared ground, a low overhang of rock that kept off the worst of the wind, Silas built a fire and put a pot of water on without ceremony. He ate a portion of dried meat and cornbread and set the same out on a flat stone near the fire's edge, within easy reach if she wanted it. She sat across the fire, outside the firelight, her back to a thick pine. She watched the flames but did not come close to them. Her lips moved now and then, very slightly, in something that was not speech. A rhythm, a pattern. He listened without trying to hear, and felt something in it that reminded him of his mother counting rosary beads in the dark after his father died. Quiet and private, and meant only for whoever or whatever waited on the other side of silence. At one point she paused her prayer, looked at her own wrists where the chain marks were still raw, and pressed both palms flat against the earth. She held them there for a long moment. Then she lifted them, looked at the red soil on her skin, and continued the rhythm of her lips. He did not know the meaning of the gesture. He lay down on his bedroll and pulled his coat over himself. He did not sleep right away. Through half-closed eyes, he watched her silhouette against the trees, the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the way her head occasionally tilted up to find a particular star. The war had taught him to track things at the edge of his vision. Old habits. But what surprised him was this. He was not watching her out of fear. He was watching her with a kind of quiet awe at something large and elemental and entirely outside his understanding. He fell asleep somewhere in the small hours without meaning to. When he woke just before dawn, the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, and the space across from him was empty. The dried meat on the stone was gone. The pot he had left with a little water in it had been cleaned and set back on the ring, and the orc was nowhere. Silas sat up and felt a pull in his chest he could not immediately explain. He told himself it was only the strangeness of the situation. He told himself the feeling would pass. Then he looked down and saw the drawing. 2 circles, drawn in the damp earth with a dry stick. They overlapped in the center, and beneath them the outline of a mountain, simple and deliberate. The kind of mark someone makes when they have something to say and no common language to say it in. Silas looked at it for a long time. Then he laid his boot beside it, not on it, and curved the sole around the outside so that the drawing would not be stepped on by accident. He studied it until the image was solid in his memory. He had seen circles like that carved into stone along the old orc trails south of the Jade Canyon. During the war, the army surveyors had dismissed those marks as territorial scratches. But Silas had grown up near a trading post where the clans sometimes passed through before the fighting started, and one of the old traders, a woman named Cressida, who dealt in leather and roots and asked few questions, had once told him that the interlocked circles meant something like 2 fates made of one thread. He was not sure he believed that, but he kept the drawing in his mind all the way home. The ride back to his farm took 3 days through the frontier pass, and for most of it he told himself he had done his part. He had freed a stranger, he had offered food and water and a safe camp. The road had forked, and she had taken her own direction. That was how it was supposed to end. He planted the east field when he got back. He mended the broken post along the creek fence. He boiled his dried beans and ate alone at the kitchen table and listened to the wind move through the eaves, the way it always did in the cool season. On the 5th night home, he dreamed of the mark in the mud. In the dream it glowed faintly, like iron pulled from a forge before it cools, and it pulsed once with a sound he felt in his back teeth rather than heard with his ears. He woke with the absolute certainty that something was not finished. He went to the window and looked out at the yard. He was expecting nothing. What he saw instead was a figure sitting on the fence beside the horse paddock, perfectly still, watching the dark edge of the tree line as though she had been there for some time and expected to be there for some time more. Even at that distance, in the moonless dark, he knew her. He did not call out. He dressed slowly and went to the door and stood on the porch until she turned her head and saw him there. She climbed down from the fence with an ease that seemed designed to look casual, but was obviously not. She was wearing the old leather tunic he had left out to dry on the porch railing 3 days ago. The one he had forgotten was there. It fit badly across the shoulders, but she wore it without any apparent concern about that. "You came back," he said. She crossed the yard and stopped at the porch steps. In the pale light from the open door, her face was clearer than it had been that first day, less guarded, though not soft. She spoke in her own language, a short sentence with the weight of something rehearsed. He shook his head. "I don't know your words." She exhaled once through her nose, which he was starting to understand was the orc equivalent of mild impatience, and then she pointed at him with 2 fingers, then at herself. Then she laced those 2 fingers together and held them up. Silas stared at the gesture for a moment. He thought of what Cressida had said about the interlocked circles, 2 fates made of one thread. He thought of the gesture Nira had made in the camp the night before she left, both palms pressed flat against the earth, holding still, then lifting them to look at the soil on her skin. He had not understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now. Among her people, it seemed, the act of freeing a person did not end a story. It began one. "I broke your chains to keep you alive," he said carefully. "Not to... that wasn't..." She lowered her fingers. She looked at him without flinching and said one word in her own tongue. Short, final. He would later learn the word meant husband. That night he gave her the back room that had been used for storage since his wife passed, cleared the crates out himself, and found a wool blanket that was not too thin. She accepted these things without gratitude and without complaint, both of which felt more honest to him than either would have. He lay awake in his own room, with his hands crossed on his chest, and thought about what in the world he was going to tell people in Haldvast. The town had a smell on market day, horse, wood smoke, sawdust, and the particular sharp tang of suspicion that gathered in any place where people lived close enough to each other to know each other's business. Silas had grown up with that smell. He had never minded it before. He minded it now. He tied his horse at the rail outside Gorvath's supply store and pushed through the door. The bell above the door rang. 3 men at the corner table looked up. One of them, Rennick, who ran the East Side cattle operation, set down his tin cup and watched Silas the way a dog watches a new door in a familiar wall. "Heard you had trouble on the Ember Trail," Gorvath said from behind the counter. He was a wide man with a thin smile and eyes that never fully committed to any expression. "Heard you found something." "Seeds," Silas said. "Winter rye and the yellow beans if you have them." "Heard it was an orc." The room was quiet enough that the fly on the window ledge was audible. Silas set his list on the counter. "Seeds, Gorvath." "Town's talking," Rennick said from behind him. "People are asking what kind of man brings a green skin onto good farmland 5 years after the war." "The kind of man whose business is farming," Silas said, not turning around. "Seeds." Gorvath looked at the list for a long moment. Then he slid it back across the counter. "I'm out of rye." Silas looked at the full rye sacks clearly visible on the shelf behind him. "Right," he said. He picked up his list and walked out. Riding home, he passed the mill, the schoolhouse, the broken water pump that the town council had been promising to fix for 2 years. He thought about what Naira had done that morning before he left. She had taken the cracked support beam from the old cellar entrance, the one he had been meaning to replace since spring, and had fit a new piece into place using only the tools available in his barn. She had done it without being asked, without ceremony, and without error. He thought about that for most of the ride home. When he arrived, the cellar beam was finished and she was on the roof of the hay barn, sealing a gap in the shingles with tar and river clay, working with the calm efficiency of someone who had been building things in difficult conditions for a very long time. She did not look down when he rode in, but she tilted her head slightly in his direction, which he was beginning to understand meant she knew he was there and that things were all right. He unsaddled the horse and started on the afternoon work, and the farm settled into its rhythm around them both, and it felt not comfortable exactly, but right. The way two people fall into step on a long road without needing to discuss it. The 3 men arrived just after the light began to die. Silas heard the horses before he saw them. A heavy, uneven approach from the south road, the kind of pace that meant the riders were not trying to arrive quietly because they did not feel they needed to. He was at the woodpile when they came through the gate, 3 of them, long coats, rifles slung across saddles. The leader had a brass badge pinned to his chest that said nothing official. It was the kind of badge a man made for himself to give his violence a shape. "Silas Dunmore," the leader said, not as a question. He was heavy-set with a grey beard and eyes that had the flat quality of someone who had stopped thinking of other people as anything complicated a long time ago. "Heard you're harbouring an orc female. Word down south is, she's property. There's a reward out on her, dead or live." "She's not property," Silas said. "Well, now, the folks who owned her before she ran would disagree." Urdi, the second rider, had already begun scanning the property. The third held back near the gate, covering the exit. Silas set down his axe slowly, his hands loose at his sides. "You need to ride back the way you came." The leader laughed, low and brief. He raised his rifle. What came next was fast. Naira dropped from the hay barn roof 10 feet straight down and landed in a crouch between Silas and the nearest rider. She had a length of oak beam in both hands, one of the leftover sections from the cellar repair. Before the man could swing his weapon, she was already moving, and the beam caught his rifle arm at the elbow with a sound like a branch breaking in a winter storm. He went sideways off his horse and did not get up quickly. The leader swung his rifle toward her. Silas moved. He caught the barrel with his left hand and drove his right fist into the man's wrist, and the shot went wide into the darkening sky. The horse screamed and reared. The leader lost a stirrup and had to grab the saddle horn to stay on. The 2 of them, farmer and orc, turned toward the third man together without any signal between them, simply because it was the natural thing to do, because they had been working alongside each other long enough that their instincts had begun to rhyme. The third man looked at them both. His rifle was still in his hands, and his eyes moved between Silas and Naira and back again. And for a moment his finger was on the trigger and the moment held. Then Naira took 1 step forward, just one, deliberate and slow, and held his gaze without blinking, without moving anything else. And the man's hand began to shake. He looked at her face, looked at the oak beam still in her grip, and made his decision. He turned his horse around and rode hard through the gate. After a moment the leader followed. The second man, the one on the ground, got up slowly, holding his arm against his chest, and stumbled after them. The sound of hooves faded. Rain began, soft and steady. Silas stood in the yard, breathing hard. Beside him, Naira lowered the oak beam and let it rest against her leg. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were still bright with the tail end of battle fire. She looked at him sideways. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke, and it was not because there was nothing to say. It was because what had just happened between them, the way they had moved as one, The way each had covered the other's blind side without a word or a plan was the kind of thing that gets smaller when you try to put it into words, and both of them were smart enough to leave it alone. The rain fell on them both. They went inside and dried off, and Silas cleaned the cut on her arm. The old one had reopened during the fight, and she let him do it without pulling away. He worked carefully, and she watched the lamp flame on the table, and the cabin smelled of pine resin and rain, and something green and mineral that he had come to associate with her presence. "They will come back," he said, tying off the cloth, "or others like them." She looked at him without flinching. "I know you could leave," he said. "Go north to the Jade Canyon passes before the snow closes them. Your clan might be up that way still. Or some of them." He kept his eyes on the knot he was tying, because he did not want her to see his face while he said the next part. "You do not owe me anything. What I did on the trail, that was just what needed doing. I do not want you to stay out of obligation. That is not—" He stopped. "That is not how I want things." The lamp guttered briefly. Outside, the rain was heavier now, drumming on the new roof shingles she had sealed that morning. She reached out and took his hands. Her fingers were much larger than his, the skin a deep, warm green, and the grip she used was deliberate and unhurried. She turned his hands over and looked at the palms, the calluses, the old split skin along the thumb lines, the small scar near his right wrist where a plough blade had jumped years ago. She pressed her lips to both palms. The gesture was so quiet and so complete that Silas had no idea what to do with himself for a moment. He had not been touched with that kind of intention since before his wife died, and that was long enough ago that his skin had forgotten what it was to be read by someone else. She said a word in her language, a new one. He did not know it. She said it again and tapped her chest, and then tapped his. He decided it meant something like belonging, or home, or possibly both. "You can stay," he said, "for as long as you want. That is not gratitude. That is, I want you to stay." She released his hands and sat back, and the expression on her face was not exactly a smile. Orcs did not smile the way humans did. But there was a settling in her, a relaxation of something that had been held tight for a very long time, and it showed in the line of her shoulders and the slow exhale she let out through her nose. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the rain spoke on the roof in the language of things that do not need to be explained. Winter came to the frontier like a verdict. The fields were put to rest, the cellar was stocked with root vegetables and preserved grain, and the gap in the south fence, the one Silas had been meaning to fix every year for 6 years, was finally mended using a technique Naira had learned from her clan's builders, where the posts were set at an angle to better catch the weight of snow without bowing. It worked better than anything he had tried. Haldvast did not warm to them, it did not openly move against them either, settling instead into the uneasy neutrality of people who have opinions but insufficient certainty to act on them. Rennick still looked at Silas with a kind of flat displeasure whenever they crossed paths at the mill. Gorvath had restocked his rye and now sold it to him again without comment, which was about as much of an apology as that kind of man ever offered. There were whispers, there were looks, but the farm was quiet, and the farm was working, and after a while the day-to-day weight of that reality began to matter more than the opinions of people who were not doing any of the work. Naira learned a handful of common words: tools, weather, directions, and a small number of words that had no practical use, but that she seemed to enjoy turning over in her mouth anyway, like the word for the hour just before sunrise, which in the frontier tongue was called the blue middle. She said it sometimes in the morning when they were both standing on the porch watching the sky lighten, and it suited that time of day so perfectly that Silas started using it too. She carved new symbols into the porch post beside the door, clan marks, he understood, but adapted, changed slightly. When he asked her with gestures what the change meant, she pointed at herself, then at him. Then at the ground beneath both their feet. This place, he understood. These marks say this is our place now. He was not a man who showed feeling easily, but he put his hand on the carved wood and held it there for a moment. And she understood that too. In the deep of one January night, Silas woke to a sound he could not immediately place. Not wind, not animals. A distant thing coming from the north, low and rhythmic. Like a drum carried on a cold current of air. He went to the window. Naira was already there, standing in the dark, completely still, her eyes fixed on the far ridge. The drumbeat continued for a few minutes and then stopped. She did not move until it did. "What was that?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said one word in her language, a name or a clan word. He could not tell which. She said it quietly, with something that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but lived in the space between them. When she turned back from the window, Silas looked at her face and understood, without needing a translation. Whatever the drum meant, it was not a greeting. It was not a farewell. It was a summons, and it was coming whether they were ready or not. He looked at the dark ridge, then back at her. "Together?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then she laced her fingers through his and held on.